New report from the United Nations Climate Panel warns
Un constat catastrophique du réchauffement climatique.
There is a new report out about climate change, and it is not positive.
The goal laid out by the United Nations is really unreasonable because it would mean draconian cuts in emissions.
Climate change caused by human activity is putting our very survival in peril.
Hello, I'm Barbara Serra, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories we're looking at this week. Covering climate change requires a media change, a rethink of how the world's biggest, most persistent story is reported. The media model pushing Viktor Orban's anti-migrant, anti-EU politics beyond Hungary's borders. They've been called propagandists for the Saudi royal family before, but now the scrutiny of some pro-Saudi journalists in the West has intensified. And is there life after reading the news?
It says in your resume you read the news for 9 years.
Between the years 2005 to 2014, I worked as a television newsreader, but I decided I needed a change.
Our lead story this week tackles an issue that, considering its magnitude, could be a fixture on every episode of our show. It's climate change and how the media are grappling with how to cover it. Only a small percentage of news audiences would have heard about the report released earlier this month by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And that's not because the report was dull or inconsequential. No, in fact, it's been called a landmark study, warning that the world has just 12 years left to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Any higher, and the risks of drought, floods, and extreme weather will soar. Coverage of the IPCC report was a flash in the pan, like so much climate change reporting is. The initial wave of headlines receded as quickly as it had emerged. Climate change is the world's most significant existential challenge, and those who want to cover it are still figuring out how to convey its size and scale. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the coverage of the IPCC report and what it reveals about the state of climate change reporting.
It's a story as big as this planet, affecting every country, every economy, every individual. And its urgency ratchets up higher every year. And yet, climate change coverage nearly always seems to need a crutch, an event to peg it on. A global conference, a protest, or, as it was this time around, the release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on global warming. The report's findings were monumental.
This is the most dire report we've had from the IPCC yet. They're basically saying we need to move now. We need to take really serious action if we want to prevent the worst impacts of climate change.
The report is something of a call to arms, telling us that the survival of our species depends on a political revolution.
These are overwhelming scientific findings, and frankly, it overwhelms scientists, and it is going to overwhelm journalists as well.
The headline in the IPCC report is stark. It says rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes are needed in all aspects of society if mankind is to contain the average global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The time frame the IPCC has set for this is just over a decade, 12 years. In the absence of a paradigm shift, a rethinking of how the world functions, the droughts, food shortages, environmental degradation, and poverty being experienced already are going to get much worse, much faster.
In some cases, I think the sort of shockingness of the report, I think led some of the coverage to jump to a kind of, we're doomed, there's no hope.
The report warns that storm intensities, wildfires, even pest outbreaks will increase, which could...
But I worry that if all of a sudden, we have this new study and it says that making progress on climate change has to be so drastic that it's more or less impossible, then people will start to get really dismayed and lose hope. And this is always the challenge of climate coverage.
The New York Times, in their main piece covering the report, had a photo of a lone child playing in the sand with these bones. And that's been kind of the style of coverage you generally get, which seems to indicate that they are more capable of imagining an apocalypse
Time is running out
than they are, for instance, of imagining increasing taxation on the ultra-wealthy, on corporations. That creates millions of good green jobs and regulates corporations and phases out fossil fuel production. They find it impossible to imagine a political alternative other than kind of apocalyptic scenarios.
That climate change isn't the most covered ongoing news story in the world is a reflection of just how many times the opportunity is missed. In the US alone, freak weather incidents over the past few years would have justified it being in the headlines every day. However, the link between climate change and weather incidents that are increasing in intensity and frequency is often never made. A 2017 study by the DC-based Media Matters Group into the coverage of Hurricane Harvey found that over a span of 2 crucial weeks, 2 main cable news outlets, ABC and NBC, didn't air a single segment mentioning climate change and its link to such weather events. This study isn't the only one of its kind by Media Matters. In July this year, it found that coverage of the heat wave across the United States followed a similar pattern.
We looked at reporting on the 3 big TV broadcast networks and found that those programs mentioned the heat wave 127 times, and only one of those mentioned climate change.
The media is not able to grasp this linkage. So for example, this year, if you just see Kerala floods in India, we had historically unprecedented flood within a period of 2 to 3 days. Something like 25 to 30 trillion liters of water fell over this small state. But if you look at the media reportage in India, they were talking about local ecological disaster, local changes in ecology, cutting of forest, and those kind of things. But the linkage between climate change and Kerala floods was not there.
This is a real problem and a missed opportunity. Climate change can seem like a really distant or theoretical problem. But when there's extreme weather, that's a real opportunity for the media to talk about climate change and how it affects extreme weather and exacerbates extreme weather.
And you think, what can I do? This is
a fixture in much of climate change reporting is the notion that individual action can help stave off the existential threat posed by global warming.
You're changing your light bulb, you're driving a different car, maybe you're eating less meat. Whatever you're doing to help the world is rubbing off on your neighbors.
Individual awareness is vital. Media emphasis on it, however, is out of proportion. The real action needs to come from industry. In 2017, the UK-based non-profit, the CDP Group, published a report correlating specific volumes of greenhouse gas or GHG emissions with the industries responsible for them. It found that since 1988, just 100 corporations have produced more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions.
This is not just a problem of me or a problem of you. There are companies, oil companies, natural gas companies, coal companies, who are responsible for the vast amount of the pollution that is causing climate change.
Where there's progress, there's energy.
Many of them have waged disinformation campaigns. They have tried to downplay and distort the science. They have got politicians in their pockets who are discouraging or blocking climate action.
If there was a list of criminals who have polluted the climate, then ExxonMobil would come at the front. British Petroleum will come as the top climate polluters. So will companies in India, in Saudi Arabia, many countries who are polluting the climate, but also have huge influence on media in terms of their contributions to advertisement and support to media. So media is very quick to talk about what governments need to do or what people need to do, but they will rarely talk about what corporations need to do.
For instance, there was a widely panned CNN tweet. The tweet was, "Scared of the new climate report? Here's a few things you can do." And of course, all the prescriptions that it made had to do with individual consumer changes. And it completely neglected the actual structural forces and corporate power that underlies the climate crisis. And I don't think the stress on the changes that individuals can make rather than on what corporations are doing is an accident. I think it is a function of the dominant ideology of our era, namely neoliberalism. which has persuaded us, or tried to persuade us, that the market is a kind of magical entity that will solve all of our problems.
Unprecedented changes. That's what the IPCC report says is needed to deal with global warming. As media outlets covered the report, almost none of them, this network included, reported on changes they would make in their own newsrooms or to their own journalistic practices. One place it might be wise to start: stop dealing with the climate change issue as separate from every other story, every other beat.
I find it quite disorienting to read the news sometimes, because you will be going from this report that's really staggering in its implications, and then on the next page there will be an article about the potential renovation of JFK Airport that doesn't say anything about the role of flying and air travel in contributing to carbon emissions and how we might need to change that quite drastically. I think that they all are very deeply connected. I think this is particularly true for reporting on the economy and economics and job growth and all of these things that make no mention of climate change, but it is our economic model that is driving climate change, and those things have to be put together much more than they are now.
I'm joined now by one of our producers, Flo Phillips, to discuss some of the other media stories that we're looking at this week. Flo, the story of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi has really taken on every twist and turn. And one of the media fallouts has been that some journalists in the West, including journalists that work at the Washington Post, which of course is where Khashoggi used to write, have actually been called out for their pro-Saudi reporting. What else do we know about this?
Barbara, the Washington Post has understandably really been quite aggressive in its campaign to find out exactly what happened, turning the heat up on Saudi Arabia's allies in the US. They even put out one op-ed with the headline, "Will you work for a murderer?" But soon after that piece was published, the investigative website The Intercept pointed out a rather unfortunate fact that Washington Post columnist Ed Rogers and contributing writer Carter Eskew were effectively working for the Saudi government via the lobbying firms that each of them runs. Within 24 hours of that Intercept piece going up, the Washington Post put out their own article saying that both lobbying companies have now cancelled their contracts with Saudi Arabia.
And so apart from these journalists stroke lobbyists, who else has the Khashoggi story really shone a spotlight on?
Well, there is one more name from the Washington Post itself, David Ignatius, the paper's longtime foreign affairs columnist. Critics have taken issue with his pro-Saudi stance. This 2017 op-ed about the Crown Prince is a prime example, although he was hardly the only person to write such pieces. The New York Times' Thomas Friedman is in the same camp, and while he attempted a weak mea culpa about the news of Khashoggi's disappearance, I'm not sure many people are buying it. It's important to note that this isn't just American journalists being called out for their pro-Saudi writing. In Britain, the Daily Telegraph's defence editor, Con Coughlin, has written a couple of articles echoing the Saudi line about Khashoggi's disappearance. One political commentator took Coughlin's writing apart, not just this piece, but other articles too, accusing him of churning out Saudi propaganda. Coughlin deleted his Twitter account soon after, and neither he nor his paper have responded to the allegations.
Yeah, a lot of fallout still continues from the Khashoggi case. Let's move to Myanmar now, though, because 3 senior journalists have been arrested there. Who are they, and what else do we know about the case?
So these journalists are from the 11 Media Group. Editor-in-Chief Cho Zo-lin, along with Managing Editor Nai Min and Chief Reporter Pho Wai-win. Now, they were all arrested following a story that they were doing scrutinising the funding of a transport project in Yangon City. The journalists were charged by the regional government using a colonial-era law. They said that the report could cause fear or alarm to the public. Now, the arrest of these men, and indeed the practice of using years-old laws to charge them, is part of a growing pattern that we've been seeing in Myanmar. Just last month, 2 Burmese journalists working for Reuters, Wa Lone and Chaw So-oo, began serving 7-year jail terms for violating the Official Secrets Act, which dates back to 1923. That ruling, it's really important to remember, was handed down despite one of the government's own police officers telling the judge that the journalists had been the victims of a setup.
Flo, thank you. After 2 consecutive terms in power and another landslide election victory this past April, there seems to be little that can threaten the rule of Viktor Orban in Hungary. But that doesn't mean the project to consolidate his power in the media has in any way eased off. In the 8 years since Orban's Fidesz party swept to victory in 2010, numerous media outlets have been shut down or seen drastic changes in their editorial line, often after changes in ownership. Which is why alarm bells rang last month when Orban allies closed in on index.hu, the last remaining outlet read and respected on both sides of the political divide in Hungary. So far, so familiar, you might say, but Hungary watchers are now observing the Orban media model gain a foothold in other European countries like Macedonia and Slovenia on the back of investments that some say seek to promote the Hungarian Prime Minister's pan-European agenda. The Listening Post's Will Young reports.
April 2018. A landslide election victory gives Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban the majority he needs to change Hungary's constitution, and the confidence to accuse media who criticize him of being fake news.
Miniszterelnök úr, megenged egy kérdést nekünk?
Maga honnan van?
Indextől vagyok.
Az egy fake news járóda, nem nyilatkozom.
Az Indexet naponta körülbelül 1 millió ember.
Index is read by about 1 million people daily. When the Prime Minister calls one of the largest and most important independent news outlets a fake news factory, it means he considers these 1 million people to be stupid.
Less than 4 months after Orban's accusation in September, a member of the Prime Minister's ruling coalition took a 50% stake in the company that controls Index's advertising revenues. Index journalists, such as editor-in-chief Gábor Miklósi, are on high alert.
The most important question is how the ownership change will affect our independence. We set up an independence barometer on a separate web domain from Index. If we feel that someone is influencing our work, then we will change the barometer from independent to either at risk or not free.
It is right for Index's staff to be very worried about the situation. Index was established back in 1999. So it has grown up essentially together with online media in Hungary. It sort of symbolizes online journalism, quality online journalism in Hungary. As soon as government proxies appear near these media outlets, it can very quickly end up in a change in its coverage, or it can also essentially be shut down, as it happened with Népszabadság.
Népszabadság was one of Hungary's last major left-leaning newspapers, when in 2016 it was purchased and quickly shut down by investors linked with Orban's Fidesz party. Since then, more changes in ownership have been followed by more closures, as well as notable shifts in editorial line.
Magyar Nemzet, one of Hungary's most prestigious daily newspapers, shut down immediately after the elections. Lánchíd Radio was also shut down. Then, Heti Válasz, a conservative weekly which had been critical of the government, was also closed. This summer, a new investor bought Hír TV, Hungary's most watched cable news channel. On the day the new owners arrived, a popular evening talk show was replaced by a Viktor Orban speech. The intentions of the new owners were clear to everyone.
Origo used to be a competitor of Index, and it used to be independent. By now, it has been completely degraded and has become a propaganda mouthpiece for the government. Other tabloids cater for even more particular niche demands. They do not function as media, but rather as subsidiaries of the Ministry of Information, directly executing government orders.
One of those tabloids is Ripost, just one of a host of relatively minor outlets that serve the bottom end of the Hungarian media market. They're low on information, high on sensation, and what news these outlets actually cover is dominated by outrage against the EU, against migrants, and against Orban's political opponents.
After 2015, many new outlets appeared out of thin air, essentially. Ripost is something that you would probably characterize as this tabloid political journalism. It's a copycat version of Informer in Serbia, which has been spreading fake news, conspiracy theories. Orban essentially imported something from another country, and now he's exporting it to other countries in the Balkans.
In recent months, Hungarian investors linked to Orban and businesses close to him have effectively been subsidizing highly politicized sensationalist media in Macedonia and Slovenia, pushing anti-migrant, Eurosceptic narratives with a large smattering of smears of opponents of the populist right. Much in the image of Hungary under Fidesz, these investments seem to have little to do with profit-making and everything to do with promoting a certain brand of politics.
In Slovenia, they bought media that is co-owned by the right-wing nationalist populist party, the SDS. Viktor Orban personally campaigned for SDS leader Janez Janša during the last election campaign. In Macedonia, Hungarian-owned media outlets called for a boycott of a referendum on changing the country's official name to enable it to join the European Union. Both there and in Slovenia, Hungarian-owned media disseminates far-right populist messages.
It is not possible in Slovenia for a company to invest so much in a loss-making media house. These media, Nova24 TV, Skandal and Demokracija, are not really separate entities, but a single media. What is published by one will appear on the others. Demokracija has an entire segment dedicated to immigration, and each example is worse than the last. There will be attacks on political adversaries based on unverified information. I see it all as one big political propaganda machine, which feeds on hate, discrimination and lies. Things that are typical of propaganda, not journalism.
The investments in both countries have been crucial, partly because they arrived just after the parties who were the previous owners lost power, and as a consequence also the resources to sustain these costly media operations. Such investments cannot be rationalized by market incentives. Without this Hungarian money, numerous media operations would have shut down.
I want to ask you, colleagues, today, what is the state of our union?
Last month, the European Parliament voted to trigger a so-called rule of law procedure against the Hungarian government for its rolling back of civil liberties and human rights, including freedom and plurality in the media.
The Hungarian government has effectively silenced independent media.
A setback for Orban's European project, but with elections to the European Parliament just months away, media investments in countries like Slovenia and Macedonia could help keep Orban's European ambitions alive.
Fidesz is building relationships with other politicians in the Central and Eastern Europe region, in countries both inside and outside the EU. On the one hand, they provide know-how, how to rule the media landscape, how to set the public agenda, how to run a propaganda media network. On the other hand, we see shopping trip acquisitions with no genuine business motivations. As in Hungary, it is not lucrative to run a propaganda machine. However, it does pay off in politics.
Central Europe has often served as a sort of early warning system when it comes to political developments, because institutions are weaker here. So when political entrepreneurs come in and try to influence them, they can be more successful. Orban is simply finding his way through those vulnerabilities. And I think it's something that could happen in other countries as well, if the media becomes this weak.
And finally, a job in journalism isn't forever. Newsrooms are cutting staff, reporters get burned out, and many other professions have better pay and better hours. Luckily, though, journalists have skills that can be useful in other lines of work: writing, researching, interviewing. And newsreaders have an additional skill set, an on-air style and clear, precise delivery. But does it guarantee us a future outside the studio? This sketch by Irish comedy trio Foyle, Arms and Hog imagines life beyond the cameras. It's a bit close to home for me, but I hope you'll enjoy it, and we'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
So, Tiernan, lovely to meet you.
Good evening. It's 5 minutes to 6.
Well, this is just an informal chat, so you can relax. It says in your resume you read the news for 9 years.
Between the years 2005 to 2014, I worked as a television newsreader, but I decided I needed a change. Change for the better, a change for the best.
Okay, and after you left newsreading, where did you work?
Dublin, 2014. With unemployment levels at record lows, I found it hard to get work in other areas. Turning to hobbies, I enjoy hiking, opera and social gatherings with friends. For a look at my sports, we go over to Colin Whittaker.
Thank you, Tiernan. Tiernan's sporting interests include swimming and five-a-side soccer, but asking him to track back is, of course, wishful thinking. Back to you in the interview.
Thanks, Colin.
When are you looking to start?
It is hoped that work will commence in the spring.
We'll see what we can get.
Thank you, and good night.
Okay, guys, I'm going to have to ask you to leave.